3 days after she walked out of the orphanage gates in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Marlo Ashcroft stepped off a rusted bus at the edge of Pinehurst Hollow, Montana, carrying one suitcase, a thin coat, and a silver locket she had worn since she was old enough to remember wearing anything at all. She had come because a lawyer's letter told her a grandfather she had never met, never been spoken to, never even been told existed, had died 6 weeks earlier and left her a cabin deep in the forest above town. She thought she was inheriting an empty house. What she found instead, behind a sealed wall at the back of the study, was a metal lock box, a stack of letters that had never been mailed. A map of a mountain the state had erased from its records, and one sentence carved by hand into the raw pine wood. Not all of them stayed below. Before the week was out, Marlo would learn that 14 men, not 9, had died in the Iron Vein Ridge collapse of 1956. She would learn that 3 of their names had been deliberately scrubbed from every public document in the county. She would learn that one of them had been alive for 3 days beneath the rock, knocking on a steel pipe, while the men above poured concrete down on top of him. And before this story ends, Marlo will discover the devastating reason a grandfather she never knew spent 70 years protecting a secret that began long before she was born, and the unbearable truth about whose blood actually runs through her veins. The bus that carried Marlo Ashcroft into Montana was older than she was. Its engine coughed every few miles, and the windows wouldn't close all the way, so a thin ribbon of cold wind ran across her cheek for most of the 4-hour ride out of Coeur d'Alene. She didn't mind. She had spent the last 19 years of her life learning how to ignore small discomforts, and a draft through a bus window was nothing compared to a steel-frame bed in a room shared with 11 other girls. She watched the country change through the smeared glass. The flat brown fields of the Idaho border gave way to slow rolling hills, and then to dark walls of pine that rose on either side of the highway like the sides of a long green corridor. The sky turned heavier the further east she went. By the time the bus crossed into Sanders County, the clouds had lowered themselves onto the tops of the mountains, and the rain had begun fine and gray and patient. She held the lawyer's letter in her lap the whole way. She had read it so many times in the past 3 days that the creases had begun to soften and tear at the corners. The paper smelled faintly of someone else's tobacco. The words on it had not changed since the morning the matron had walked into the dormitory with that strange, careful expression on her face and said, "Marlo, there's a letter for you, and you'd better come downstairs to read it." Mr. Thaddeus Ridgway of Pinehurst Hollow, Sanders County, Montana, deceased 6 weeks prior at the age of 94, had named her as the sole inheritor of his estate. Such as it was: a cabin, some acreage, a small bank account that after taxes and the lawyer's fee would amount to less than $2,000. The letter said all of this very politely and very flatly, as if it were nothing unusual at all for a girl to learn at age 22 that she had ever had a grandfather to begin with. She had never been told his name. Not once. Not in the file the orphanage kept on her. Not in the few cracked memories she still carried from the years before she was placed there. Her mother had been a woman named Lenora Whitfield, who had died in a car accident on a wet road in northern Idaho when Marlo was 3, and that was the end of the official story. There had been no grandparents listed, no emergency contacts, no phone numbers in the margins. The space where a family should have been was simply blank. And then 3 days ago, the letter. The bus shuddered to a stop at a turnout that hardly qualified as a station. A faded wooden sign nailed to a telephone pole said, Pinehurst Hollow in chipped white paint. The driver, a heavy man who hadn't spoken to her since Spokane, twisted around in his seat and looked at her over his shoulder. "This is you, miss." She nodded. She stood. The other passengers, 6 of them, an old couple and 4 loggers in stained jackets, did not look up. She walked down the aisle with her suitcase banging gently against her knee, stepped off into the rain and stood on the wet shoulder of the road while the bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel. For a long moment after the engine sound was gone, she heard nothing at all. Then the rain. Then a single crow somewhere in the trees behind her. Then nothing again. Pinehurst Hollow began about 200 yards down the road. She could see it through the drizzle. Low buildings of weathered wood and faded brick set back from a 2-lane street that ran along the bottom of a long, narrow valley. A diner with a sign that said coffee in red neon, although only the C and the second F were lit. A gas station with 2 pumps. A church with a white steeple darkened by years of rain. A general store with a striped awning. And rising over all of it, the mountain. Black with pine and gray with cloud going up and up until its top disappeared into the weather. She walked into town the way you walk into a room where everyone has just stopped talking. The few faces she passed on the sidewalk glanced at her once and looked quickly away. A man unloading bags of feed from the back of a pickup paused with one hand on the tailgate to watch her go by. A woman in the window of the diner set down her coffee cup slowly and did not pick it up again until Marlo had crossed the street. She had been in Pinehurst Hollow for less than 10 minutes, and she already understood that they had been expecting her. She found the lawyer's office above the hardware store, up a narrow wooden staircase that smelled of varnish and dust. The lawyer was a thin man named Bramwell, with white hair brushed flat against a pink scalp. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, blinked twice, and said, "My God, you look just like your mother." Then he caught himself as if he had said too much and busied himself with the papers on his desk. He gave her a brown envelope. Inside were 2 keys on a leather thong, a hand-drawn map showing the route up to the cabin, and a single sheet of legal paper for her to sign. He asked her if she had a ride. She said no. He sighed and stood up and said he would drive her part way, but the road got too narrow for his car at a certain point, and she would have to walk the last half-mile herself. The drive up the logging road took 15 minutes. Bramwell did not speak. The rain thickened. The pines closed in on either side of the gravel track until it felt as though they were driving through a tunnel made of trees. At a wide place in the road where a fallen log had been pushed off into the ditch, the lawyer stopped the car and pointed with one finger up the slope. "Straight up that way, about 20 minutes on foot. You can't miss it." She got out. He turned the car around in the narrow space and drove back down the mountain. And within a minute, the sound of his engine was gone, and she was alone with the rain and the trees and her suitcase. She walked. The trail was old. Wagon ruts cut into the dirt half a century ago, softened now by moss and pine needles. The slope was gentler than the lawyer had made it sound, but the air was thinner than she was used to, and after a few hundred yards, her chest began to burn. She slowed. She listened. There was no bird song this far up the mountain, only the rain and her own footsteps, and somewhere far off, the slow groan of wind moving through the high branches. She came around a bend, and there it was. It stood in a small clearing at the foot of a steeper slope, where the trees pulled back just enough to let the gray sky touch the ground. A cabin of dark logs, low and long, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney. The roof was patched in 3 places with mismatched shingles. The windows were dark. A pair of rocking chairs sat on the porch facing the trees, and between them was a small table with a tin coffee cup still resting on it, the rim crusted with old rain. She stood at the edge of the clearing for nearly a full minute before she could make herself walk closer. It did not look abandoned. That was the strange thing. Abandoned places have a way of slumping, of giving up, of letting the weather inside. This place looked instead like a man had walked out the front door an hour ago to go check on something and just hadn't come back yet. The boots on the porch were arranged neatly side by side. The split firewood under the eave was stacked in a careful pyramid. A pair of leather work gloves had been laid across the railing to dry, and the rain had soaked them and unsoaked them so many times over the past 6 weeks that they had begun to curl into the shape of the hands that used to fill them. She climbed the porch steps. The boards creaked under her weight, but they were solid. She set down her suitcase. She fitted the larger of the 2 keys into the lock, and it turned with a soft, clean click, as if it had been oiled within the past week. The door swung inward. The smell that came out to meet her was not the smell of an empty house. It was the smell of pipe tobacco and wood smoke and coffee and old books and cedar planks. It was the smell of a life. She stood on the threshold a long moment before she stepped inside, and when she did it slowly, the way a person enters a church. The front room had a low ceiling crossed by dark beams. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a wool blanket folded over the back of an armchair pulled close to it. A kerosene lantern stood on the mantel. A pair of reading glasses lay on the small table beside the chair, folded over an open book, the page held by a strip of leather. She crossed to the chair and looked down. The book was a worn edition of a Wallace Stegner novel. The leather bookmark was tucked between pages 184 and 185. He had been reading that page when whatever happened happened. She moved on. The kitchen was small and clean, a cast-iron stove, a hand pump at the sink instead of a faucet, a row of tin canisters labeled in faded ink, flour, sugar, coffee, salt. A wooden table for two with one chair pulled out a few inches, as if someone had recently risen from it. On the windowsill above the sink stood a single coffee cup, washed and dried, waiting to be used again. A narrow hallway ran from the kitchen toward the back of the cabin. She walked it slowly. There were two doors. The first opened onto a small bedroom plainly furnished, the bed made tight as a soldier's. A framed photograph stood on the dresser. She picked it up. A young woman with dark hair and a serious mouth stood beside a tall, thin man in a sheriff's uniform, and both of them were holding a baby in a white blanket. She turned the photograph over. Written on the back in pencil, in a careful hand, were the words, Rosalind and Callum with the baby spring, 1955. Marlowe stared at the names. She did not know them. But the woman in the picture, the woman holding the baby, had something in the line of her jaw and the set of her eyes that made Marlowe's chest tighten in a way she could not explain. She put the photograph back exactly where she had found it. The second door was different. It was at the very end of the hall, set into a wall of paneled pine. The door itself was thicker than the others. The hinges were heavier. The door frame had been reinforced with a band of dark iron at the top and bottom. The lock was newer than the one on the front door and brighter, as if it had been replaced within the last year or two. She tried the smaller key. The lock resisted. Then it turned. The door swung inward, and she stepped into the study of Thaddeus Ridgway for the first time. The room was small, smaller than she expected. A single window faced west toward the trees, its glass streaked with rain. A wooden desk stood under the window, scarred by years of pen marks and coffee rings. Shelves climbed the walls on three sides from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was crowded with books, file boxes, rolled maps, and stacks of papers tied with twine. The air in this room was different from the air in the rest of the cabin. It was heavier. It was the air of a place where a man had spent decades sitting alone, thinking very hard about something he could not put down. A dark wool coat hung on a peg behind the door. A pair of muddy boots stood beneath it. On the desk lay an open notebook with a pencil resting across it. The pencil sharpened down nearly to the eraser. Beside the notebook, a coffee mug stained brown at the bottom. Beside the mug, a pair of reading glasses folded. She lowered herself into the desk chair. It creaked. She had the strangest feeling sitting there that she had borrowed the seat from someone who would be back at any minute. She opened the top drawer. Inside were the small things a man keeps within reach. A pocket knife with a bone handle, a magnifying glass, a box of wooden matches, a roll of postage stamps, a leather wallet empty. and tucked along the back of the drawer, half hidden under a yellowed receipt, a single photograph. She drew it out. It was black and white, and the edges had softened with age. 14 men in canvas work clothes stood in 2 rows in front of a tunnel cut into a wall of pale rock. The men in the back row leaned on long-handled tools. The men in the front row sat on overturned buckets with their hands folded between their knees. They were not smiling. They were not posing. They had the tired, patient faces of men who had been called away from work for 1 minute to stand in front of a camera. In the middle of the back row stood a younger version of the man Bramwell had described to her this morning. Tall, lean, narrow at the shoulders. A long jaw. Hair combed back from a high forehead. He was perhaps 30 years old in the picture. He was looking directly at the camera, but he was not looking at the photographer. He was looking past him at something else. Thaddeus Ridgway, her grandfather, or so she had been told. She turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink were 2 lines. Iron Vein Crew, October 1956. Below that, in smaller letters, the week before. She held the photograph in both hands and stared at it for a long time. She did not know what the week before referred to. She had a feeling sitting alone in that small room, in that quiet cabin, in that gray afternoon, that she did not yet want to know. She slid the photograph back into the drawer and closed it. She turned in the chair and looked at the shelves. The file boxes on the lower shelf were labeled in heavy black marker with dates. 1956, 1957, 1962, 1971, 1984. The labels were in the same handwriting as the photograph caption. Some of the boxes were thick. Others were thin. The box marked 1956 was the thickest of them all. She rose and reached for it. That was when she noticed the wall. It was the wall behind the desk, the long inner wall that ran the length of the room. At first, she had registered it only as a wall of paneled pine like the others, but as she straightened up with the file box in her hands, the late gray light from the window caught it at a low angle, and she saw what the straight light had hidden. A seam, a vertical line fine as a hair running from the floor up to a point about 6 feet above it, then turning 90 degrees and running for another 2 feet before stopping. She stared at it. She set the file box on the desk. She crossed to the wall and ran her fingertips along the seam. She could feel the edge of it. She could feel where one panel ended and another began. She crouched down. She looked closer. 3 iron nails near the bottom of the panel had been driven in cleaner than the rest. They were lighter in color. They were not original to the wall. The wall had been opened and closed more than once. She looked behind her at the desk. She thought about the way her hand had brushed against something hard under the drawer lining when she first opened it. She returned to the desk and pulled the top drawer out completely and set it upside down on the floor. There, fastened to the underside of the wood with 2 small screws, was a flat brass lever no longer than her finger. She pressed it. A soft click sounded inside the wall behind her. She turned. Slowly, she walked to the panel. She pressed the flat of her palm against it, and the panel moved. Not far, half an inch. A thin breath of cool, stale air sighed out around its edges. She caught that breath in her face and held still. For a moment, she thought about closing the panel again, about sliding the drawer back into its place and going out to the front room and lighting a fire in the fireplace and pretending she had never sat down at that desk. She was 22 years old. She had been a grown woman for less than a year and a half. She had come here for a cabin and a small inheritance. She had not come here for whatever this was. But she had also spent her entire life being told in 1,000 small ways that whatever she wanted to know about who she was and where she came from was not for her to know. She slid her fingers into the seam and pulled the panel open. The space behind it was shallow, no more than 8 inches deep, the length of a coffin laid on its side. It had been lined with rough plywood and painted black, and resting inside it on a small wooden shelf nailed to the back wall was a single object, a metal lockbox, olive green, battered. The corners scored deep with scratches, as if someone had tried more than once to pry it open with a chisel and failed. She lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the desk and set it down in the pool of gray light from the window. Then she turned back to the open panel and looked at the wood inside the cavity more carefully. There on the inner face of the panel itself, where it would only be visible to a person standing inside the hidden space, looking out words, had been cut into the raw pine with the point of a knife. 6 words, carved deep. The cuts were old, but the letters had been retraced more than once, deepened over the years by a patient hand that wanted to make sure the words would not fade. Not all of them stayed below. She read them. She read them again. She read them a 3rd time, and on the 3rd reading, something in her chest went very still. The way an animal goes still when it hears a sound it has not heard before, but recognizes anyway. She did not yet know what the words meant, but she understood in some part of her body that knew things her mind did not, that she had just crossed a line she could not uncross, that she had just walked through a door that would not let her back out the way she had come in. She lowered herself into the desk chair, set the lockbox in her lap, and tried to open it. The latch was stiff but not locked. She had to work it back and forth several times before it gave. When it did, the lid lifted on its hinge with a small, dry creak, as if it had not been opened in a very long time. Inside lay paper, letters in their envelopes bundled with twine, folded documents on heavy stock, the seals long since broken, a stack of photographs face down, a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked across the spine, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, a single sealed envelope with one word written across the front in heavy ink. Marlowe, her own name, in a handwriting she did not recognize. She did not touch the envelope yet. She was not ready. She lifted out the notebook instead. She opened it. The first page was dated October 3rd, 1956. The handwriting was the same as the writing on the back of the photograph in the drawer. They closed the North Drift again today, the third time this month. Foreman says the mountain shifted in the last storm. The mountain didn't shift. The mountain never shifts that fast. Whatever's happening down there, they don't want a record of it. She turned the page. 2 of the boys came up white today. Wouldn't go back below after the lunch whistle. Said they heard knocking through the rock from the East Drift after the last blast. Said it wasn't tools. Said it wasn't water. She turned the page. Pulled 3 names off the duty roster tonight. No accident report filed. No body recovered. No telegrams sent to next of kin. When I asked the office about it, I was told to go home and not come back tomorrow if I couldn't keep my voice down. She turned the page. Her fingers had begun to tremble. The sheriff came up the road tonight to see Callum. They sat on the porch for an hour and didn't say much. When he left, he told Callum that the families had already suffered enough, and there was no use in dragging the rest of us through it. Callum waited until the sheriff's taillights were gone. Then he came inside and looked at me across the table for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "They're going to seal the East Drift before sunrise tomorrow." She turned the page. The next entry was short. The handwriting was harder, as if the pen had been pressed too firmly into the paper. October 18th, 1956. There were 14 men inside Iron Vein Ridge when the East Drift collapsed. The number released to the newspaper this morning is 9. Below that, in even darker ink, was a single line. They told us to bury the story with the mountain. We did not bury all of it. The rain on the window had thickened into something nearer to a steady drum. The light in the room had begun to fail. She did not realize until she lifted her eyes from the notebook that she had been holding her breath for longer than her chest could remember how to handle. She let it out slowly. It was at that moment, exactly that moment, that someone knocked on the front door of the cabin. 3 knocks, slow, heavy, spaced apart in a deliberate way, as if the person on the porch wanted her to have time to count them. She closed the notebook. She set it down on the desk very carefully. She stood up. The chair creaked beneath her. She crossed to the open panel and slid it back into place until she heard the soft click of the catch. She closed the desk drawer. She left the lockbox on the desk because there was nothing she could do with it in the time she had. She walked out of the study and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. She walked down the hallway. She crossed the front room. She paused with her hand on the door handle. 3 more knocks. The same rhythm. Slow. Patient. She opened the door. A man stood on the porch in the rain. He was old. That was the first thing she registered. He was very old. Tall and lean, with the kind of stoop that came from a long career of carrying weight on his shoulders. He wore a dark canvas coat that had been waterproofed so many times the original color was hard to guess at, and a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low over his eyes. A neatly trimmed white beard covered the lower half of his face. The hand that rested on the porch railing was knotted with arthritis but steady. He did not introduce himself first. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, the way an old man looks at the face of a stranger who reminds him of someone he used to know. Then he glanced past her shoulder into the lighted front room of the cabin, and his eyes lingered for a half-second on the open hallway that led toward the back of the house, and Marlowe understood, without being told, that he was looking for something specific, something he had hoped not to see. When he looked back at her, his face had softened by a single degree. "You'd be the granddaughter," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, steady, worn smooth like a stone in a creek. "I guess I am," she said. He nodded once, as if her answer had only confirmed what he already knew. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest, and the rain ran out of the brim and onto the porch boards in a thin, steady stream. "Name's Garrison Pike. I was sheriff in this county for 31 years. Retired a long time ago now." She did not know what to say. She nodded. She stepped back from the door without inviting him in, but she did not close it either, and after a moment, he took the gesture for what it was and stepped past her into the cabin. He stood in the front room and looked around. He did not touch anything. He did not move. He just looked. The blanket on the chair, the book on the table, the reading glasses still folded on top of it. After a long moment, he closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again and crossed to the fireplace. He crouched with effort. He laid kindling. He struck a match from the box on the mantel and lit the fire he had clearly built in this same hearth 1,000 times before. The flames caught, climbed, and the room began to warm. He stood. He turned to face her. "I knew Thaddeus near 60 years, he said. "I figured if there was going to be a stranger in his house tonight, she ought to have a fire going." She did not know how to answer. She crossed her arms and stood with her back to the closed front door. "Mr. Pike," she said. "Garrison, please." "Garrison," she said. "Why are you here?" He did not answer right away. He looked into the fire. He looked back at her. His pale eyes held on her face with the kind of attention that was neither friendly nor unfriendly. It was simply careful. "I'm here," he said, "because 3 days ago, a man named Sterling Ravencroft came down to my house in town and asked me whether I knew when the new owner of this place was due to arrive." She felt the room shift very slightly. "I told him I didn't know," Garrison continued. "I told him it wasn't my business anymore who came up this mountain. He didn't like that answer, but he took it. Then he left." He paused. He turned his hat over in his hands. "I waited until his truck was out of sight. Then I drove up here myself, and I sat on this porch for an hour, and I thought about what your grandfather would have wanted me to do." "What would he have wanted you to do?" she asked. Garrison Pike looked at her for a long, level moment. "He would have wanted me," the old man said, "to make sure you understood, before anything else, that there are people in this town who would rather you turn around tomorrow morning and go back where you came from." The fire popped behind him. A log shifted. A shower of orange sparks rose up the throat of the chimney. Marlowe did not move from the door. "Why," she said. Garrison Pike's jaw worked. He looked toward the hallway again, toward the closed door of the study at the end of it. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time, something like sorrow moved across his face. "Because for 70 years, this town has been very, very careful," he said, "not to remember certain things. And your grandfather was the only man in Pinehurst Hollow who refused to forget them." He did not stay long after that. He told her he would not say more tonight. He told her that some things ought to be discovered, not given. He told her that he lived in the second house past the Methodist church on Larkspur Street, and that the porch light burned all night, and that if she ever needed to come down off this mountain and sit at someone's kitchen table at 3 in the morning, that kitchen table would be set for her. Then he put his hat back on his head. He paused at the door. He did not look at her when he spoke again. "That door at the end of the hallway," he said. "The one with the iron bands." She waited. "If you opened it," he said, "lock it again before you sleep tonight." He walked out into the rain. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard his boots on the wet gravel of the path. After a minute or two, she heard the distant cough of a truck engine starting up at the bottom of the trail, and then the slow rumble of it descending the mountain back toward town. She stood at the door for a long time after the sound was gone. She did not lock the study door that night. She sat at her grandfather's desk, and she read the journal of Thaddeus Ridgway by the light of the kerosene lantern until the rain stopped sometime after midnight, and the silence of the mountain came down around the cabin like a held breath. She read about safety reports filed and ignored. She read about a foreman named Callum Whitfield, the man in the photograph in the bedroom, the man whose name was written on the back of a picture of a young woman holding a baby in 1955. She read entry after entry in which Thaddeus Ridgway recorded in his careful pencil hand the small acts by which a mining company in 1956 had decided that 14 men were worth less than the cost of a federal inspection. She read until her eyes burned. Then she closed the journal. She rose. She walked through the silent cabin to the small bedroom at the front of the house. She did not undress. She lay down on top of the blanket fully clothed, and she pulled the wool coverlet up to her shoulders, and she stared at the dark wood ceiling and listened to the cabin settle around her. She did not sleep. Not for a long time. She slept eventually near dawn, and when she woke, the light in the room was gray and thin, and the rain had returned, but softer now, more like a presence than a storm. She made coffee on the cast iron stove. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the wet trees. She watched a doe step out of the timber at the far edge of the clearing, look at the cabin for a long moment, and step back into the trees again. She walked into town that afternoon. She had to. There was almost no food in the cabin. The kitchen had been emptied out, as such kitchens always are after a death by some neighbor's hand. A single tin of crackers, a half bag of coffee, a jar of preserves with a year-old date written on the lid. She put on her coat. She walked the 2 miles down the mountain road into Pinehurst Hollow. The general store with the striped awning was the only place open on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. A brass bell over the door rang softly as she stepped inside. The store smelled of cinnamon and floor wax and old wood. A woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger. Her hair was silver pinned back from her face. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue. She set down her pen. She did not say what most people would have said. She did not ask if she could help. She did not say, "Good afternoon." She looked at Marlowe across the counter for a long, quiet moment, and then she came around from behind it and stopped 2 paces away and folded her hands. "I knew you would come down today," she said. "I bought milk this morning so it would be fresh." "I'm sorry," Marlowe said. I know," the woman said. "You don't know me. I'm Opaline Reddick. I have run this store for 41 years. Your grandfather came in every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock and bought 1 loaf of bread, a pound of coffee, a jar of preserves, and 1 can of beef stew. He did this for 40 years. He never bought anything more, and he never bought anything less, and I never asked him why." She paused. Her pale eyes moved over Marlowe's face the way Garrison Pike's had moved over it the night before. Carefully, almost reverently, as if she were comparing it against another face she had been carrying in her memory for a very long time. "You have your great-grandmother's mouth," Opaline Reddick said quietly. "I haven't seen that mouth on a living face in almost 70 years. Marlowe did not know what to say. Opaline filled a paper sack with food while they talked, which is to say, while Opaline talked and Marlowe listened. Bread, cheese, a small ham, apples, a jar of honey, a bag of dried beans, a box of tea, She added each item without looking at the shelf the way a woman moves through her own kitchen at night. And when she was finished, she set the sack on the counter and folded the top down twice and tied it with a length of clean string.
"I'm not charging you for this,"
Opaline said.
"Don't argue with me. You can pay me next month."
Marlowe took the sack. She thanked her. She turned to go. At the door, she stopped, and she turned back, and she asked the question she had not been able to stop thinking about all morning. "Mrs. Reddick," she said, "who was Callum Whitfield?" The bell over the door had stopped ringing. The store was so quiet she could hear the second hand of the wall clock behind the counter. Opaline Reddick did not answer for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was so low that Marlowe had to lean toward her to hear it. "He was the only man in this town Opaline said that your grandfather loved like a brother. And he was the first one they sealed inside the mountain." The bell over the door of the general store rang once as Marlowe stepped back out into the gray afternoon. She did not remember opening the door. She did not remember walking out. She remembered distantly the feeling of the paper sack against her ribs and the soft weight of the bottle of milk Opaline had slipped into the top of it at the last moment. She walked up Larkspur Street without seeing it. She passed the Methodist church. She passed the second house with the porch light that Garrison Pike had told her was his. She did not stop. At the edge of town, where the pavement ended and the logging road began its slow climb back up into the trees, a black pickup truck was waiting. It was idling at the side of the road, its engine running soft, its windshield wipers ticking slowly against the rain. As she came around the bend, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps 50 years old. His hair was iron gray and cut short. He wore a dark wool overcoat over a flannel shirt and clean denim, and the boots on his feet were the kind of boots that cost a great deal of money and were never asked to do any actual work. His face was tanned and even-featured, the kind of face a man trains over decades to give nothing away. He smiled at her as she approached, and the smile reached his mouth, but not his eyes. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. She stopped on the gravel about 10 feet from him. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "I apologize." He raised one gloved hand in a small, formal gesture. "Sterling Ravencroft. My family has lived in this valley a very long time. I felt it would have been impolite to let you go a second day in Pinehurst Hollow without paying my respects." She did not answer. He took one step closer. Just one. Not enough to threaten. Just enough to take the conversation slightly out of the public road and slightly into something more private. "I was very sorry to hear about your grandfather," he said. "Thaddeus was by all accounts a man of considerable principle. I did not know him well. He kept to himself, as I'm sure you've already discovered. But he was a fixture of this community, and his passing left a mark." "Thank you," she said, because she did not know what else to say. He nodded once. His eyes did not leave her face. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, I run a company that has been looking for some time at certain parcels of land on the eastern slope of the ridge above your grandfather's cabin. The mineral surveys came back very favorable last spring. We are in the early stages of what may in the next several months become a significant project for this valley. New jobs, new tax revenue, a real future for a town that, as I'm sure you've noticed, hasn't seen one in some time. He paused. He waited for her to speak. She did not. Your grandfather's parcel sits in a location that, for reasons of access and topography, would be of considerable value to the project. I made him a generous offer for it 3 years ago. I made him a more generous offer 2 years ago. He declined both. I respected his decision then, and I have not pressed the matter since, out of regard for the man. He paused again. I would like to renew that offer to you, he said, at a price substantially above market value. Today, in cash. I have the paperwork in the truck. You could be on a bus tomorrow morning with more money in your pocket than most people in this valley will see in a lifetime. She did not look at the truck. She did not look at his outstretched hand. She looked instead at his face, and she saw beneath the practiced calm, beneath the smooth voice, beneath the careful smile, one thing she had not been expecting to see in the face of a man who was offering her a great deal of money. She saw fear. Mr. Ravencroft, she said. Sterling, please. Mr. Ravencroft, I haven't even slept 2 nights in that cabin yet. His smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The fear deepened a degree. He had not expected resistance. He had expected a girl from an orphanage, broke and tired and overwhelmed, to take the money and run. Of course, he said smoothly. Of course. I understand entirely. I would not dream of pressuring you to make a decision today. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small white card and held it out to her between 2 gloved fingers. When you've had time to think, he said. Call any of those numbers, day or night. I'd consider it a personal favor. She took the card. She did not look at it. Mr. Ravencroft, she said. He waited. What is it about my grandfather's land, she said, that you and your family have wanted so badly for so long? The smile finally faltered for just a second. Then it returned, perfect. It's a beautiful piece of property, he said. And the views, as I'm sure you've noticed, are remarkable. He nodded once. He turned. He climbed back into the truck. The door closed with the muffled, solid sound of an expensive vehicle. The engine note deepened. The truck pulled away from the shoulder and started down the road into town, and she stood there in the rain with the paper sack against her ribs and the white card in her hand and watched it go. Only after the truck was gone did she look down at the card. It was thick, expensive paper, embossed lettering. Ravencroft Holdings, LLC. A phone number. An office in Helena. An office in Denver. An office in Houston. She put the card in her coat pocket and walked the rest of the way up the mountain. She did not go inside the cabin when she reached it. She set the sack of groceries on the porch. She stood at the top of the porch steps, and she looked out across the wet clearing toward the wall of pines. And she felt, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that the trees were watching her back. That was when she saw the footprints. They began at the bottom of the porch steps, where the gravel of the path gave way to the soft black mud of the clearing. They led across the open ground in a slow, careful line away from the cabin and toward the timber on the eastern edge of the trees. They were not her footprints. They were too large, and the tread was wrong. They were not Garrison Pike's either. His boots had left a different mark on the gravel last night, smaller with a worn heel. They were fresh. The rain had filled them only halfway. Whoever had made them had walked past the porch within the last hour while she was down in town. She stood very still on the steps. She did not move for a long count. Then she set the groceries inside the front door of the cabin. She picked up the kerosene lantern from the mantel without lighting it. She buttoned her coat to the throat, and she stepped down off the porch and began to follow the footprints across the wet clearing toward the trees. The light was already beginning to fail. The prints led her into the timber along a faint trail she had not noticed before, an old game path winding between the trunks of the pines. The rain had softened to a fine mist that hung in the branches and turned the deeper woods into a place of muted greens and grays. She walked slowly. She watched the ground. The prints continued. They climbed gently. They angled north away from the cabin, away from the mountain road, away from anything she had any reason to think existed up here. She walked for what felt like a long time and might have been only 20 minutes. The trees thinned. She came out into a small hollow at the foot of a rock outcrop. The pines drew back into a rough circle, and in the center of the circle, half hidden by a tangle of huckleberry and young fir, stood a low cabin she had not known was there. It was tiny, smaller than her grandfather's, built of dark logs gone almost black with age. The roof was sod grown over with moss and grass, and a single small pine sapling that had taken root in the corner. A stovepipe rose from one end. A thin gray ribbon of wood smoke curled out of it. Someone lived here. She had walked 30 minutes through the woods from her grandfather's cabin and come upon a man's house she had not known existed on land she had been told was hers. She stood at the edge of the clearing. She did not approach. She did not call out. She watched the door. After perhaps a minute, the door opened. A man stepped out onto a flat slab of stone that served as a porch. He was very old, older than Garrison Pike, older than anyone she had ever seen up close. He wore a long gray wool coat that hung on him as if it had been bought for a heavier man 40 years ago. His beard reached the second button of the coat white as snow. His hair fell past his shoulders, the same white. His eyes, even at this distance, were a pale washed blue. He saw her at once. He went very still. For a long moment, they looked at each other across the clearing. The young woman and the old man, the rain whispering down through the pines around them. Then he took one small step forward and another until he stood at the very edge of the stone porch, and he said in a voice that was thin and cracked from a great deal of silence and not nearly enough use, "You have Callum's eyes." The wind moved softly through the trees above her. Somewhere far off, a single crow called once and went silent. Marlowe Ashcroft stood in the wet hollow with a kerosene lantern in her hand and stared at a dead man on the porch of a cabin that was not supposed to exist. And she understood finally what the words carved into the wall of her grandfather's study had been trying to tell her all along. Not all of them stayed below. She did not move. The old man on the porch did not move either. The two of them stood in the wet hollow looking at each other for what felt like a long time, and Marlowe became aware slowly of small, particular things. The way the rain ran along the brim of the sod roof in a thin line and fell in a curtain at the edge. The way the white beard of the old man stirred a little in the breath of wind that came down out of the high timber. The way her own heart was beating in the side of her throat in a slow, strong rhythm, as if it had decided without consulting her that this was not a moment to panic. Finally, he raised one knotted hand, not in greeting, in something closer to surrender. "I won't hurt you," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had not used it in front of another human being in a very long time. The words came out rough and dry, like the first words of the morning after a long sleep. "You don't have to come any closer if you don't want to," he said. "But it's about to rain harder, and there's a stove inside." She did not answer. She looked at his hands, empty, cracked across the knuckles, spotted with age. The hands of an old man, not a dangerous one. "I have to ask you something," she said. "Of course," he said. "Did you walk past my grandfather's cabin today?" He nodded once, slowly. "I did," he said. "I walk past it every Tuesday. I have walked past it every Tuesday for 67 years. I do not go up onto the porch. I do not look in the windows. I walk the line of trees at the eastern edge of the clearing, and I count to make sure the cabin is still standing, and then I come home. I am sorry if I frightened you." "You knew Thaddeus," she said. The old man's mouth moved in something that was not a smile, but lived in the same country as one. "I knew Thaddeus," he said. "He has known I was up here for a long time. He brought me flour and coffee twice a year. He never came into the cabin, and I never came into his. We agreed on that a long time ago." He paused. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "You have his hands too, the way you're holding that lantern." Callum used to hold a hammer in his offhand exactly like that. She stepped forward. She did not decide to. Her feet simply moved her across the wet ground until she was at the foot of the stone slab that served as his porch, and she looked up at him there in the failing light, and she said, "Who are you?" He looked down at her for a long moment.
My name is Obadiah Lansing, he said. I was a powderman on the Iron Vein crew. I went down into the East Drift on the morning of October 16th, 1956, with 13 other men. I am the only one of those 14 who ever came back up. The wind moved through the trees. A drop of rain fell from the edge of the sod roof and landed on the toe of her boot.
"Have been waiting for you," Obadiah Lansing said for a very long time. She did not go inside his cabin that afternoon. She could not. There was too much in her chest that needed open sky around it. She told him she would come back. He told her he was not going anywhere. He said it with a small, dry breath of something that might once in another life have been humor. She turned and walked back through the trees the way she had come. The light was nearly gone by the time she reached her grandfather's cabin. She climbed the porch. She stepped inside. She set the unlit lantern back on the mantel. She did not turn on a light. She sat down in the armchair in front of the cold fireplace and stared at the wall. 14 men had gone into Iron Vein Ridge in October of 1956. The newspaper, which she had now read twice, said 9 had died. Her grandfather's journal said all 14 were inside the mountain when the East Drift collapsed. The old man in the woods, who had no reason to lie and every reason not to be alive, said he was the only one who had come back up. 5 men, 5 names. 5 men whose deaths had been removed from the public record so cleanly that for 70 years the people of Pinehurst Hollow had walked past their absence without seeing the shape of it. She slept that night in the armchair with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She woke when the gray light of morning began to show along the seams of the curtains. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window. She did not eat. Then she walked back into the study and she closed the door behind her and she opened the lockbox again. This time, she went straight to the journal. She read all of it. It took her until mid-afternoon. There were 46 entries between October 3rd and November 9th of 1956. They were not in order of how a story is told. They were in the order in which a man writes things down when he is trying to keep the truth of them from being lost. There were lists of names, lists of dates, lists of equipment, serial numbers, and shift assignments, and the small purchases the company had made in the weeks before the collapse. A delivery of 68 cases of nitrate explosive on September 28th. An order of additional steel shoring on October 2nd that had been canceled by telegram on October 5th. A visit from a state mine inspector on October 7th that had ended after 40 minutes with the inspector accepting an envelope from the company office before he drove back down the mountain. There were carbon copies of letters from Thaddeus to the office of the company requesting that the East Drift be reshored before further work was authorized. Letters from the office of the company back to Thaddeus, denying the request signed at the bottom in a tight, precise hand by a man named Ambrose Ravencroft. Letters from Thaddeus to a man at the Federal Labor Office in Helena, in which he laid out in the calm, careful language of a man who knew he might one day be cross-examined on his choice of words, the precise pattern of deferrals and dismissals that had preceded the collapse. None of those letters she saw had ever been answered. There were the names. A page in the middle of the journal listed all 14 men who had been in the East Drift on the morning of October 16, 1956. The names were written in a careful column down the left side of the page. Beside each name in the right-hand margin was a single notation. Recovered, 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 recovered. And then beside the last 5 names in the same patient hand, not recovered, Callum Whitfield, Obadiah Lansing, Silas Crane, Hosea Brennan, Foster Doyle. She read those 5 names 3 times. She set the journal down. She got up and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran the hand pump until cold water came up and she splashed it on her face and she went back to the study. She opened the bundle of unsent letters next. They were addressed to her. She had known they would be. She had felt the weight of that envelope in the bottom of the lockbox from the first moment she had seen her own name on the front of it. But she had not expected the bundle. She had not expected so many. There must have been 30 of them tied together with a strip of brown twine. The earliest was dated April of 2007. She would have been 3 years old. To whoever is caring for my granddaughter. I am told that opening up old grief for a child this young serves no purpose, and I have decided for now to abide by that judgment. But I cannot let the days pass without writing her name down somewhere it will not be lost. Marlowe. Her name is Marlowe Ashcroft. I am keeping these pages in case there is ever a day she is old enough to ask, and I am still here to answer. The next was from her 6th birthday. The one after that was from her 9th. They were short, 2 pages, 3 pages. They contained no demands. They contained no apologies. They contained instead careful descriptions of small things. A storm that had blown down a pine in the side yard. A doe that had stood in the clearing for a long time one morning and looked toward the cabin and stepped away. A book Thaddeus had been reading that he thought she might like one day. The kinds of things a man writes when he is trying year after year to keep a thread of his ordinary life stretched out across the dark, in the hope that someone eventually will pick up the other end of it. She read every letter. She was sitting on the floor of the study by the time she reached the last one. The lockbox was open on the desk above her. The journal was open beside it. Her back was against the legs of the desk chair, and her knees were drawn up to her chest. The light at the window had gone gray and weak. She did not get up to light a lamp. The last letter was dated February of the previous year. He had written it 8 months before he died. "If you ever come up this road," the last letter said, "I want you to know one thing before anything else. You were not given up. You were sent away. There is a difference, and I am the one who chose to make it. I will write that difference out for you on paper when I am ready, and I will leave the paper where you will find it. Until then, I want the words sent away to do the work that needs doing. You were sent away on purpose. You were sent away by a man who loved you and did not have the right at the time to keep you near. I do not ask you to understand this. I only ask that you do not let yourself believe for one more day of your life that you were unwanted." There was no signature on the letter. There did not need to be. She sat on the floor of her grandfather's study with the letter in her hand for a long time. The room grew dark around her. She did not move to make it lighter. When she finally rose, her legs were stiff and her face was wet, and she did not entirely remember crying. She washed her face at the kitchen sink. She lit the kerosene lantern on the mantel and built a fire in the fireplace, and stood in front of it until the warmth of it had reached the bone of her shoulders. Then she went back into the study, and she did the next thing. She unwrapped the silver locket from around her neck. She had worn it as long as she could remember. The chain had been replaced twice over the years, but the locket itself had always been the same. A small oval of tarnished silver, no larger than the pad of her thumb, with a delicate engraved pattern on the front that had been rubbed smooth in the center, where she had pressed it absently with her thumb 1,000 times a day for 19 years. It had no photograph inside. It had never had one. She had asked when she was small why her locket was empty. She had been told gently that some lockets just were. She set the locket on the desk beside the lantern. She picked up the magnifying glass from the top drawer. She had not ever in her life looked at the locket through a magnifying glass before. She held it now under the lens. At the bottom edge of the oval, where the two halves of the case came together, there was a hairline seam she had assumed all her life was simply the natural meeting place of the metal. Through the lens, she could see that it was not. The seam ran the entire way around the edge of the locket, even on the side that was not supposed to open. And on the back set into the silver, at a place she had not noticed in 19 years, was a tiny round depression no larger than a pinhead. She set the magnifying glass down. She picked up the bone-handled pocket knife from the top drawer of her grandfather's desk. She opened the smallest blade. She set the tip of the blade in the tiny round depression on the back of the locket. She pressed. A second seam opened soundlessly along the back of the silver oval. The back of the locket lifted on a hinge she had not known existed. Inside the false back was a thin disk of dark material about the size of a grain of rice. She tilted the lantern closer. It was a piece of film, a piece of microfilm, cut into a tiny circle and pressed flat between the inner back of the locket and the false outer back, where it had ridden against her skin for 19 years. She sat down in the desk chair very slowly. The cabin around her was completely silent. She did not know in that moment what was on the film. She did not need to. She knew with a certainty that ran from the small of her back all the way up to the base of her skull what its presence meant. Thaddeus Ridgway had taken whatever was on this film, and he had hidden it on the body of a 4-year-old girl, and he had sent that girl to a place 6 states away, and he had spent the next 19 years writing letters he never mailed, because the safest place in the world for the thing he most needed to preserve was the neck of a child no one in Pinehurst Hollow knew existed. She closed the locket. She closed it gently. She closed it the way you close the eyes of someone who has just died. She put the chain back over her head and dropped the locket back inside her shirt against her skin, where it had been her whole life. Then she did the thing she had been putting off since the first time she had touched the lockbox. She picked up the sealed envelope with her name on the front of it, in a hand she had only that afternoon learned to recognize, and she broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. There were 3 sheets of paper inside. The handwriting on all 3 was Thaddeus Ridgway's. She did not read them yet. She set them on the desk in front of her face up, and she sat looking at them for a long minute, and she made herself a small, private promise that whatever was written on those pages, she was not going to be alone in the cabin when she read them. Not for the first time. She had had a lifetime of receiving important pieces of information alone in rooms with the door closed. She was going to do this one differently. She folded the 3 pages back into the envelope. She slid the envelope inside her coat against her ribs. She rose. She put out the lantern. She banked the fire. Then she walked back down the mountain road toward town in the last of the daylight, with her grandfather's letter inside her coat and her grandfather's microfilm hanging from her neck. It was nearly dusk when she reached Pinehurst Hollow. The light in the front window of Opaline Reddick's store was the only one on the block. The brass bell rang as she came inside. Opaline looked up from the same ledger she had been bent over the day before, and her face changed when she saw Marlowe's. "Come in," Opaline said. "Lock the door." Marlowe locked the door. Opaline turned the sign in the window from open to closed. She walked to the back of the store and lifted a section of the counter on its hinges, and she beckoned Marlowe through, and she led her into a small back room with a coal stove and a kitchen table and 2 chairs. She put the kettle on. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask what Marlowe had found. She simply set out 2 cups and a small dish of honey and a plate with 3 pieces of brown bread on it. And she sat down at the table across from Marlowe and folded her hands and waited. I think Marlowe said that my grandfather hid something on me when I was a little girl. Opaline did not blink. I think Marlowe said that he hid it well enough that whoever was looking for it did not find it. Opaline poured the tea. She set 1 cup in front of Marlowe. She did not pick up her own, where she said quietly. Marlowe drew the locket out from under her shirt and held it in her palm. Opaline looked at it for a long moment. Of course he did, Opaline said softly. Of course he did. You knew. I did not know that, Opaline said. I knew he sent you away. I knew he did it the night your mother died, and I knew he did it without telling anyone in this town except for me and Garrison Pike. And we never asked him to tell us because we knew without being told. The Ravencrofts had been watching your mother for the last 6 months of her life. We all saw it. None of us could prove it. Your mother knew it. She tried to leave town with you the week before she died. She did not make it. The road was wet that night. She paused. She looked at her own hands on the table. He came down to my back door at 3 in the morning the day after the funeral, Opaline said. He had you in his arms. He had a paper sack of your clothes. He asked me to drive him to a bus station in another state. I did. He paid for your ticket, and he handed you to a woman from a church, and he watched the bus pull out of the lot. He did not cry. He did not say anything for the entire drive home. The next Thursday at 6 o'clock, he came into the store and bought 1 loaf of bread and a pound of coffee and a jar of preserves and a can of beef stew. And he did that every Thursday for 40 years. And I never once asked him if he was sorry. There was no point. He was sorry every day. It would have been an insult to make him say so. Marlowe set the locket down on the table between them. Inside this, she said, is a piece of microfilm. Opaline closed her eyes. He used to take pictures of every document that came across the office desk at the mine, she said softly. He had a little German camera he had brought back from the war. He kept it in a tin in the kitchen drawer. He used to joke that one day someone in this valley was going to need to see what he had been seeing for 30 years, and he wanted to make sure it would be ready when they did. She opened her eyes. I did not know he had reduced any of it to film, she said. I did not know he had put it on you, but I am not surprised. He had to put it somewhere they would never look. Marlowe lifted the cup of tea. Her hands were shaking. She put it down again. There is something else, she said. Tell me, Opaline said. There is a man living in a cabin in the woods above my grandfather's place, Marlowe said. An old man. He told me his name is Obadiah Lansing. He told me he was on the Iron Vein crew. He told me he is the only one of the 14 who ever came back up. Opaline Reddick went perfectly still in her chair. After a long moment, she reached across the table and laid one age-spotted hand over Marlowe's.
"Then your grandfather," she said quietly, "kept the largest piece of evidence in this valley alive for 67 years without a single soul in this town knowing it." She squeezed Marlowe's hand once. Then she stood up. "You need to talk to Garrison," she said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow." The Methodist church on Larkspur Street was dark. The second house past it had a porch light burning exactly as Garrison Pike had said it would. He answered the door in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a dish towel over one shoulder, the smell of coffee coming out of the kitchen behind him. He looked at Marlowe and at Opaline, and he did not ask why they were on his porch at 7 o'clock in the evening. He opened the door wider, and he stepped aside, and he said, "Kitchen's warm." They sat at his kitchen table. He did not turn on the overhead light. He lit 2 oil lamps instead, and the room settled into a softer, older kind of brightness. And the 3 of them sat together with their hands around mugs of coffee, and Marlowe told them everything. She told them about the hidden panel and the lockbox and the journal. She told them about the 5 missing names. She told them about Obadiah Lansing in the woods. She told them about the microfilm in the locket. She told them about Sterling Ravencroft on the road at the edge of town with a stack of paperwork in his truck. She did not show them yet the 3 sheets of paper folded inside her coat. She was not ready. Garrison Pike listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she was finished, he sat for a long time with his eyes on the surface of the table. Then he raised his head. "There is a thing you need to know," he said. She waited. "Sterling Ravencroft is not interested in your grandfather's parcel because of the views." "I know that," she said. He nodded once as if her answer pleased him. His company filed for a mineral permit on the east face of Iron Vein Ridge 11 months ago, he said. The permit application is for a lithium extraction operation. The state has been slow to act on it because there are unresolved questions in the historical record about prior mining activity on that face, and the Bureau of Land Management has been waiting on a federal site inspection before they sign off. That inspection has finally been scheduled. It is set for 3 weeks from this coming Friday. He paused. He folded his hands on the table. If that inspection happens before Sterling Ravencroft has had the chance to do what he intends to do, Garrison said, an inspector is going to walk up onto that ridge with a clipboard, and he is going to find an old sealed mine portal, and he is going to want to know why the original site map in the state archives lists 14 names on the closure paperwork, while the historical record in every newspaper of record only lists 9. He looked at Marlowe. If, on the other hand, the inspection happens after Sterling Ravencroft has had 3 weeks to bring heavy equipment up that ridge and regrade the entire east face. Garrison said that inspector is going to walk up onto a clean construction site with fresh fill and a leveled portal and nothing in the ground to ask questions about. The kitchen was quiet. "He needs the cabin," Marlowe said. "He needs the cabin," Garrison agreed. "The only road heavy enough to bring his equipment up to the east face of Iron Vein runs across the south corner of your grandfather's land."
Your grandfather refused him a right of way for 30 years. Sterling cannot start work until that right of way is his. He has 3 weeks. You have what he needs. That is why he was on the road waiting for you yesterday afternoon, with cash in his glove compartment. Marlowe set down her coffee cup. He is not going to wait 3 weeks for me to think about it, she said. No, said Garrison Pike. He is not. Opaline laid her hand over Marlowe's again on the table. Drink your coffee, child, she said gently. Then we are going to drive you back up the mountain, and we are going to make sure that cabin is locked from the inside. They drove her back up the mountain in Opaline's old station wagon. Garrison rode in the back seat. Neither of them spoke much on the drive. At the head of the trail, they got out, and Garrison walked her up the path to the cabin with a heavy flashlight in his hand. The clearing was empty. The porch was as she had left it. Inside the fire she had banked, had burned down to coals. Garrison walked through every room. He checked the back door. He checked the windows. He stopped at the open door of the study and looked at the lockbox on the desk for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned and came back out into the main room. Lock this door behind me, he said. Bank the fire. Sleep with the lamp on if it helps. I will be back up here at first light. He paused at the threshold. Marlowe, he said. She looked at him. You are not alone in this. I want you to remember that. Then he stepped out into the dark and pulled the door shut behind him. She locked it. She listened to his footsteps on the porch boards. She listened to them cross the gravel. She heard, after a minute, the station wagon start at the foot of the trail. She heard it grind slowly down the mountain. Then she heard nothing at all. She stood for a long moment with her back against the locked door. Then she turned and walked into the study and sat down in her grandfather's chair. She took the envelope out of her coat. She drew out the 3 sheets of paper. She read them. The first page began with her name, Marlowe. If you are reading this, there are some things I never said to you in person that I owe you the truth about, and I am going to set them down now because no one else can. The first thing is that I am not your grandfather. She stopped. She read the line again. She read it a 3rd time. The letters did not change. I am not your grandfather, not by blood. I will tell you who I am, and then I will tell you who you are, and then I will tell you why I did what I did with the time I had. She read on. I came to Pinehurst Hollow in 1953 to take a powderman's job at Iron Vein Ridge. I was 21 years old. I had nothing. I came up the road one afternoon in a borrowed truck and a borrowed coat, and the first man I shook hands with on the floor of the office that day was a foreman named Callum Whitfield. He was 28. He took me down into the drift the next morning with his own hand on my shoulder, and he kept it there until I had learned which side of a primer cord to crimp. He taught me how to read the face of a wall of rock for the way it wanted to break, and he taught me how to keep my own mouth shut around the office men, and he taught me by the example of his own life what it looked like for a man to be honest in a place that did not want him to be. He was the best man I ever knew. He was the only man I ever called brother. He had a wife named Eliza and a baby daughter named Rosalind and a small white house on the south edge of town. When the East Drift was sealed on the morning of October 18th, 1956, with him and 4 other men still inside it, the office took my name off the duty roster for the rest of that week and told me to stay home. I did not stay home. I sat on the rim of the ridge above the sealed portal for 3 days and 2 nights in the rain, and I listened to the sound of a steel pipe being struck from inside the mountain by a man I knew. The sound went on for almost 3 full days. I will not write here what it was like to hear it. I will only tell you that on the morning of the 3rd day, a pump truck came up the road and a crew of company men poured a column of wet concrete down the air shaft, and the sound stopped, and it did not start again. I went down off the ridge that afternoon. I went to Callum's house. I sat at his kitchen table with his wife Eliza, and his baby daughter Rosalind, and I made Eliza a promise that I have kept for 69 years. I promised her that as long as I was alive, no one of Callum Whitfield's blood would ever stand alone against the family that had killed him. Marlo set the page down. She rose. She walked to the kitchen and ran the hand pump and drank a glass of cold water. She walked back to the study. She sat down. She picked up the 2nd page. Eliza died of a fever in the winter of 1959. Rosalind was 4 years old. There was no other family. I married her mother before she died for the same reason I am writing this letter now, so that the child of Callum Whitfield would have a name that did not draw the eye of the Ravencroft family. Rosalind Whitfield became Rosalind Ridgway on a piece of paper that was filed in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning in February of 1959 by a clerk who owed me a favor. She grew up in this cabin. She called me her father, and I did not correct her because there had not been time before her mother died to tell her the truth, and afterward there was no use in it. Rosalind grew up. She married a man from Bonner's Ferry named Theodore Ashcroft. She had 1 daughter. They named her Lenora. Lenora grew up. She married a man whose name I will not write here because he is still alive, and he was not a bad man, only a weak one. They had 1 daughter. They named her Marlo. You are the great-granddaughter of Callum Whitfield. You are the only person of his blood now alive in the world. Marlo sat with the page in her hand and read that line and read it again and read it a 3rd time. The lamp on the desk hissed quietly. The rain had started up again outside, soft against the window. She picked up the 3rd page. Your mother was killed in a car accident on a wet road in northern Idaho in the spring of 2007 when you were 3 years old. The road was wet. There were no witnesses. The Ravencroft family had been watching her for 6 months prior. I will not tell you in this letter what I believe about that accident, because I do not have the proof of it, and I am trying very hard on these pages to tell you only what I can prove. I will tell you only this. Within 48 hours of your mother's funeral, a man named Cornelius Ravencroft, who is the father of the man who is now trying to buy this cabin from you, drove up this mountain road in a long black car and parked at the foot of the trail. And he sat in that car for 2 hours, and he looked up the trail at this cabin, and then he drove away.
I sent you to the orphanage that night.
I sent you because I could not protect you here, and I could not raise you under any other name without him finding you, and because there was no person of Callum Whitfield's blood left in the world, but you and I had made a promise to a woman who had been dead for 48 years, that I would not let his line end in a wet road or a quiet house or a faked accident. I sent you somewhere they would not think to look under a name they would not know to look for. I put your great-grandfather's evidence on a chain around your neck, because the one place in the world a man like Cornelius Ravencroft would never think to search was the body of a child he did not know existed. I have written you 31 letters in the 19 years since I sent you away. I have not mailed any of them. I did not mail them because the moment a postmark from Pinehurst Hollow arrived at that orphanage, you would have been found. I am sorry. I am more sorry than I have words on this page to tell you. I have lived in this cabin alone for the entire length of your childhood, and I have done it because I believed it was the only way to keep you alive.
You are not Marlowe Ridgway. You are not even Marlowe Ashcroft, although that is the name on every paper you have ever signed. You are Marlowe Whitfield. You are the great-granddaughter of a man who was murdered by being left to knock on a steel pipe under a mountain for 3 days while the men above him sealed it with concrete to protect a balance sheet.
If you have come this far in this letter, then I am already dead, and you are sitting in my chair, and the time has come for me to tell you the last thing I owe you. I am sorry I could not be there to tell you any of this in person. I loved you every day of your life. I never stopped. The 3rd page ended there.
Marlowe Ashcroft, who had spent 22 years believing she was the daughter and granddaughter of no one in particular, sat in her great-grandfather's friend's chair and held the 3 sheets of paper in her hands, and she did not cry. The crying would come later. What came to her now instead was something quieter and harder and older. It was the feeling of a door closing somewhere far back in her mind, the door she had carried inside her since she was old enough to know that her mother was dead and her father had never been around, and her family was a blank line on a form. That door had been open her whole life. It had been letting in a cold wind for 19 years,
And now sitting in a small room at the back of a small cabin at the top of a mountain road in a town she had never heard of 2 weeks ago. The door swung gently shut, and the cold wind stopped. She folded the 3 pages. She put them back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the desk beside the open lock box. She rose. She walked to the kitchen. She put more wood on the fire. She washed her face. She came back to the study. She sat down again at the desk, and she opened the journal to the page that listed the 14 names. And she ran her finger slowly down the right-hand column of notations. Recovered, 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 not recovered. Callum Whitfield. She lifted her finger from the page. She closed the journal. She closed the lockbox. She slid the box behind her on the floor against the wall, where it would be out of sight from the door. She lit a fresh wick in the kerosene lantern. She turned the flame low. She put out the lamp on the desk. She walked out of the study and pulled the heavy door shut behind her, and she turned the key in the new bright lock, and she walked through the dark front room of the cabin to the front door, and she checked the bolt, and she checked the windows, and she sat down in the armchair in front of the fireplace with the kerosene lantern on the small table at her elbow and the unlit poker from the hearth across her knees. She did not sleep. She listened. The cabin creaked around her in the small ways that old cabins creak. The fire ticked. The wind came up the mountain in long, slow waves and went through the high branches of the pines in a sound like the breathing of a very large animal. An owl called once far off and was answered even farther off by another. Sometime past 2 in the morning, by the small clock on the mantel, she heard a footstep on the porch. It was a single soft footstep. Just one. The board second from the door creaked under the weight of a man trying very hard to be quiet. Then nothing. Then, after a long pause, another footstep. This one was farther from the door. Then nothing again. She did not move. She did not breathe. She heard very faintly the sound of a gloved hand testing the doorknob. The knob turned 1/4 of an inch and stopped against the bolt. It did not turn farther. There was a long, listening silence. Then she heard the sound of footsteps moving along the porch toward the kitchen window. She heard the soft rasp of a hand on glass. She heard the footsteps move back. She heard them go down the porch steps. She heard them on the gravel. She heard them cross to the trees at the east edge of the clearing. She heard them stop. Then she heard nothing for the rest of the night. She did not move from the chair until the first gray light of morning began to come in around the edges of the curtains. When it did, she rose stiff and cold, and she walked to the front door, and she slid the bolt, and she opened it. On the planks of the porch, directly in front of the threshold, where she would have to step on it to leave the cabin, lay a single sheet of folded paper. She crouched down. She picked it up. She unfolded it. It was a piece of expensive cream paper, the kind that comes out of a printer in an office that bills by the hour. There were 3 lines of typed text on it centered on the page. 3 weeks is a long time to be alone in a cabin in the woods. You have not yet been given the price your grandfather refused. Come down to town today, or I will come back up here tonight. There was no signature. There did not need to be. Marlowe Whitfield, 22 years old, 3 days off a bus from an orphanage in Idaho, stood barefoot on the porch of a cabin she had inherited from a man who was not her grandfather, and read the note twice, and then she folded it neatly along its original creases, and she slid it into the pocket of her coat, where it hung on the peg by the door. She did not look afraid. She looked instead like a woman who had finally been told the name of the thing she had been carrying her whole life, and who was now ready for the first time to set that thing down on the table between herself and the man who had put it there. She did not go down to town that morning. She made coffee on the cast iron stove. She drank it standing at the kitchen window. She watched the gray light spread slowly across the wet clearing and touch the tops of the pines on the eastern edge. She washed her cup. She set it on the sill where her grandfather's cup had stood the day she arrived. She put on her coat. She slid the folded note from the porch into the inside pocket against her ribs. Then she walked out of the cabin, and she crossed the clearing, and she went back into the trees on the old game path toward Obadiah Lansing's house. She found him sitting on the stone slab that served as his porch. He had a tin cup in his hand and a thin blanket across his shoulders. He looked up as she came out of the timber, and he watched her cross the small clearing toward him, and he did not seem surprised to see her. "I thought you might come back today," he said. "Sit down." She sat down on the stone slab beside him. Up close in the morning light, she could see his face more clearly than she had been able to see it the day before. His skin was the color of an old leather glove. His pale blue eyes were rheumy at the edges, but steady at the center. His beard had been recently trimmed with a knife, not scissors, and not very well. "There is something I need to ask you," she said. He nodded once. "Did my great-grandfather," she said, "knock on a pipe for 3 days while you were down there with him?" Obadiah Lansing closed his eyes. For a long moment, he did not answer. The wind moved a little in the high branches. A small bird called and was answered. "He did?" The old man said. "He did." His voice was not steady on the words. He took a slow breath. Then he steadied it. "I will tell you," he said. "I will tell you, because Thaddeus told me the last time he came up here with a sack of flour that one day a young woman might walk out of the trees and ask, and that on the day she did, I was to tell her everything I could remember. He did not tell me your name. He told me I would know your face when I saw it. He was right. You have your great-grandfather's mouth." He set the tin cup down on the stone beside him. The East Drift was bad ground from the beginning, he said. We all knew it. We had told the office for a year. The office did not want to hear it. The office had a quota. The office had a man in Helena to keep happy. The office had a contract with a smelter in Butte that did not allow for a slowdown. They told us to keep working. We kept working.
On the morning of the 16th, your great-grandfather came down into the drift with the rest of us. He was the foreman. He came down because the office had sent word the day before that we were to drill a deeper face into the east wall by the end of the week. He did not want any of us drilling that wall without him standing next to us. He was that kind of man.
He took 2 of us into the deepest pocket of the drift, the place where the wall was worst. Me and a man named Foster Doyle. He set the charges himself. He sent us back along the drift before he lit the cord. He told us to take cover behind the timber shoring at the second turn. We did. We heard the charges go off. We heard the wall come down, the way a wall comes down when it does what you want it to do. Then, very softly, we heard the rest of the mountain begin to come down with it. I will not try to tell you what that sound is like. I will tell you that it lasted for a count of 40. That for the first 10 of those, it was the sound of a thing settling, and for the next 30, it was the sound of a thing collapsing, and that when it stopped, there was a silence so complete that for a moment I thought I had gone deaf. The drift behind us had filled. The drift in front of us had filled. There were 8 of us in the space between, and we did not know it yet, but we were already buried. He paused. He took a careful breath. Callum was alive. We could hear him calling from the pocket beyond the second turn. He had not been crushed. He had been cut off by perhaps 30 feet of broken stone from the rest of us. We could not get to him with our bare hands. We tried. We tried for the better part of a day. He talked us through it the whole time. He told us where the air shaft pipe ran along the east wall of his pocket. He told us he could feel cool air coming down it. He told us that as long as that pipe was clear, he could last. He told us at one point that he was sorry he had brought us down there that morning. I will not write to you what we said back to him. Some of it was not the kind of thing a man says aloud more than once in his life. By the second day, Hosea Brennan and Silas Crane had died of their injuries from the collapse itself. They had been closer to the wall when it came down than the rest of us. We could not save them. We laid them at the back of our pocket, and we sat with them through the night. By the morning of the 3rd day, there were 5 of us left alive. Foster Doyle, a boy named Eustace Knapp, 18 years old, a man named Theron Bailey, Callum on the other side of the wall, and me. We had not heard anything from the surface in 2 days. Not a drill, not a hammer, not a voice, nothing. What we had heard instead was Callum's pipe. He had a small pick in his pocket. He used it to strike the airshaft pipe in 3 slow taps, then a pause, then 3 more. He did it once an hour. He did it because he wanted us to know he was still alive, and he wanted the men on the surface to know it too. He did it for 2.5 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, near the middle of the day, I heard machinery on the surface. We all heard it. The boy Eustace began to cry because he thought it was a rescue. It was not a rescue. It was a pump truck. We heard the engine of it positioned above the air shaft. We heard the rumble of a hose being lowered. We heard, after a while, the sound of wet concrete beginning to move down the throat of the pipe. Callum heard it too. He stopped tapping for a long minute. Then he tapped twice. Just twice. Hard. Then he began to tap continuously fast, the way a man drums his fingers on a table when he has run out of words. Then the sound of the concrete reached him. It is a sound I will not describe to you. It is a sound that I am 92 years old and have not been able to forget for one day of my life since. The pipe went quiet. We sat in the dark in our pocket of the drift, and we listened to the pipe being filled the rest of the way up to the surface. The concrete was poured for a long time longer than was necessary for one man. They were not just sealing Callum's pocket. They were sealing all the pockets. They were sealing us. It was Foster Doyle who realized first. Foster had worked the ventilation system of the mine for 20 years. He knew that the air shaft pipe was not the only way air came into the East Drift. He knew there was an old exhaust adit that ran from the back wall of our pocket up at an angle through about 60 feet of soft rock to a hidden opening on the back side of the ridge. The exhaust adit had not been used in years. It had been mostly collapsed since 1948. But Foster believed that if a man dug straight up at the right angle from a certain spot in our pocket, he might be able to cut into what was left of that adit and follow it to daylight. He showed us the spot. He gave us his pick. He could not climb it himself. He had a leg crushed from the collapse, and he knew it. Neither could Theron Bailey, who had been bleeding internally for 2 days by then and would not last another night. The boy Eustace had not been hurt, but he was small and frightened, and his hands shook. The pick was mine. Foster Doyle gave me his coat before I started up. He said the air would be cold in the adit, and the coat had a deep pocket in the lining, and he wanted me to take what was in the pocket out of the mountain with me if I made it. He did not say what was in the pocket. He said only if you make it, give it to your foreman's wife. He meant Eliza Whitfield. He meant Callum's wife. I climbed. I did not know it would take me 31 hours to climb 60 feet through rotten rock with a hand pick and one lamp. I did not know that Theron Bailey would die behind me on the second night of the climb. I did not know that the boy Eustace would lose his nerve on the third morning and try to climb up after me and slip and fall back down into the pocket and break his neck on the floor of it. I did not know that when I finally cut my way out into the daylight on the back side of the ridge on the evening of October 22nd, 1956, I would crawl out of the hole and look around and understand by the slant of the sun that I had been buried for 6 days and and that no rescue had ever come. I lay on the ground at the mouth of the hole for an hour. Then I crawled into the trees. I crawled because I was already starting to understand in the part of my mind that had not been entirely broken by what I had heard at the airshaft pipe, that if the company knew I had come out of that mountain, they were not going to allow me to keep doing so. I made it as far as Thaddeus Ridgway's cabin the next morning. I did not knock on the front door. I lay down in the woodshed and I waited. When he came out to split kindling, I called his name from inside the shed in a voice he barely recognized. He came in. He looked at me. He did not say a word. He went back into the cabin. He came back with a blanket and a jug of water and a piece of bread. He sat down on the floor of the woodshed with me, and I told him in a whisper that lasted perhaps 20 minutes everything I have just told you. When I was finished, he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "You cannot stay here. They will look here first." He told me about the old line shack in the hollow at the foot of the rock outcrop, half a mile north through the trees. He told me he had been the only person to set foot in it in the last 10 years. He told me he would bring me food and matches and coal and never tell another living soul that I was up there, and that as soon as the company had stopped looking for me, which he believed would take a great many years, we could revisit the question of whether I could ever come out. The company looked for me for a long time. They never quite stopped. Thaddeus told me over the years when it was safe to come down off the rock outcrop for an evening, and when it was not. He has been bringing me flour and coffee and tallow twice a year for 67 years. He never told a soul, not Eliza, not Rosalind, not Garrison Pike, no one. You are the first person besides Thaddeus Ridgway who has known I am alive since the morning of the 22nd of October, 1956. Obadiah Lansing reached into the front of his coat. He drew out a small object wrapped in a square of oilcloth. "This," he said, "is what Foster Doyle gave me in the dark on the night before I started to climb." He laid the oilcloth in his lap and he opened it. Inside lay a piece of card, a Union card, battered, stained dark brown at the edges and in patches across the face of it. The printing on the front was almost illegible. The name on the front, written in by hand in pencil, was still readable. Callum Whitfield, Local 117. He turned the card over. The back of the card was crowded with writing. The writing had been done in something that was not ink. It was darker. It had soaked into the card more deeply. It had been done with a fingertip in a hand that had been hurrying, but had been very careful with each letter. Marlowe could not read the writing from where she sat. She did not need to. She knew before he spoke again what was on the back of the card. Your great-grandfather, Obadiah said, knew that the pump truck was coming. He knew it for perhaps 15 minutes before the concrete started. He could hear the engine through the rock. He spent those 15 minutes writing on the back of his Union card with the only ink he had left. He passed the card through the pipe to Foster Doyle in our pocket about 10 minutes before the sound of the concrete reached him. Foster put it in the inside pocket of his coat. When Foster gave me his coat the next night, he told me what was in the pocket, and he told me what your great-grandfather had asked him to do with it. I have carried this card on my body for 67 years, Obadiah said, because there was no one to give it to. He held it out to her. There is now, he said. She took the card. She took it with both hands. She held it in her lap. She turned it over, and she read what her great-grandfather had written on the back of it in his own blood, while the men above him prepared to bury him alive. If a child of mine ever lives, the writing said, tell her I knew her name before I knew my own end. The cabin in the woods, the trees, the morning sky. None of it was there anymore. There was only the card in her hands and the letters written in dried blood across it, and the sound somewhere very far away in the bone of her chest of 3 taps on a steel pipe. She did not cry. The crying had not arrived yet. What arrived instead in the empty space behind the crying was a long, steady, quiet anger. It was not the anger of a young woman. It was the older kind, the kind that knows what it is for. She closed the card. She wrapped it back in the oilcloth. She slid it inside her coat against her ribs, beside the typewritten note from the porch and the 3 pages of her grandfather's letter. Mr. Lansing, she said. Obadiah, he said. Obadiah, she said, I need you to come down off this mountain with me today. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. The walk back to Thaddeus Ridgway's cabin took them most of 2 hours, because Obadiah Lansing had not walked more than half a mile in any direction in a great many years, and because the old game path was steep in places, and because she made him sit down every 15 minutes on whatever stone or log was nearest, and she gave him water from the canteen at her belt, and she waited while his breath slowed. When they came out of the trees at the edge of the clearing, she stopped. Sterling Ravencroft's black pickup was parked at the edge of the clearing. He was leaning against the front fender with his arms crossed in the same dark wool overcoat he had worn on the road into town. His face was turned toward the cabin. He did not see them yet. He was waiting. She stepped back into the trees and pulled Obadiah Lansing gently with her. He came without resistance. She raised her hand to her mouth and looked across the clearing. Garrison Pike's truck was not there. Opaline's station wagon was not there. The clearing was empty except for Sterling Ravencroft and his black pickup and the rising column of smoke from the chimney of a cabin he had ordered broken into 2 nights before. She was 22 years old. She was alone in the woods with a 92-year-old man who could barely walk. She had a piece of microfilm around her neck, a union card written in blood inside her coat. A great-grandfather buried under 60 feet of concrete on the ridge above her, and 3 weeks before a federal inspector would arrive to find that ridge regraded to dirt, she had 2 choices. She could wait in the trees with Obadiah until Sterling Ravencroft tired of waiting and left,
and then she could try to get the old man down the mountain to town by a longer road, and she could hope that Sterling did not come back tonight with 2 men instead of 0. Or she could walk out of the trees into the clearing right now without Obadiah, and she could face the man at the truck herself. She thought about it for almost a full minute. Then she turned to Obadiah Lansing and she said, "I need you to stay here, behind these trees, out of sight. Do not come out for any reason, no matter what you hear, until I come back for you. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," he said. She squeezed his hand once. Then she walked out of the trees and across the wet clearing toward the truck. Sterling Ravencroft saw her at 20 paces. He pushed himself away from the fender and stood straight. He smiled the way he had smiled on the road into town. The smile reached his mouth, but not his eyes. "Marlowe," he said. "There you are." She stopped 10 feet from him. "You wrote me a note," she said. "I did," he said. "I'm sorry to be so direct. I'm a man on a short timetable." "I trust you understand." "I understand," she said. He spread his hands. "Then, can we please," he said, "end this nonsense and sit down inside that cabin and have a civilized conversation about a piece of paper and a check?" "There is not going to be a check, Mr. Ravencroft." His smile did not waver, but a small muscle moved in his jaw. "I think," he said gently, "that you should consider that statement very carefully before you commit to it." "I have considered it," she said. She slid one hand into the inside pocket of her coat. He watched the hand. He did not move. She drew out a folded sheet of plain white paper. She held it up between 2 fingers. "I went down to Opaline Reddick's store last night," she said. "Then I went over to Garrison Pike's kitchen. We sat at his table for a long time. While we were sitting there, a woman named Imogen Vance, who is a reporter for an investigative news outlet I think you may be familiar with, was on the telephone with Garrison from her office in Helena. She has been working on a piece about the historical record of the Iron Vein Ridge mine for the better part of a year. She did not have a primary source until this week. She does now. I sent her 3 things this morning by overnight courier from the post office in Pinehurst Hollow. The first was a photograph of a piece of microfilm that has been in my possession since I was 4 years old. The microfilm shows the original signed safety report from October 7th, 1956, recommending immediate cessation of work in the east drift of Iron Vein Ridge, and the office memorandum overruling that report signed at the bottom by Ambrose Ravencroft. The second was a photograph of a union card belonging to a man named Callum Whitfield, on the back of which is a message your grandfather had hoped would never be read by anyone. The third was a typewritten note on Ravencroft Holdings paper that was slipped under the door of this cabin last night at approximately 2 a.m. Threatening me. She paused. Imogen Vance has all 3 of those items in her hands as of about 30 minutes ago, Mr. Ravencroft. I have copies. Garrison Pike has copies. Opaline Reddick has copies. 3 days from now, if I am not standing in good health on the steps of the courthouse in Helena, giving an interview alongside a 92-year-old man named Obadiah Lansing,
who is the only living survivor of the iron vein collapse. The story runs in full with every signature your grandfather ever put on a piece of paper at that mine. It runs the day after that in the Helena Independent Record. It runs the day after that in 3 more papers your family also has no influence with. She lowered her hand. If, on the other hand, I am standing on those steps in 3 days, the story still runs. But you have 3 days between now and then to be the man who walked into the federal inspector's office in Helena and turned over the rest of the records yourself. You have 3 days to decide whether your name appears in that story as the man who tried to bury 14 workers a second time, or as the man who, when given the chance, finally let them out. She paused.
Either way, Mr. Ravencroft, the mountain is not going to be regraded. Not in 3 weeks. Not ever. Sterling Ravencroft looked at her for a long time.
The smile was gone now. It had not gone all at once. It had gone the way snow goes off a roof in the sun, in patches, in pieces, until the face beneath it was bare. What was left was the face of a man, perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, who had been raised since boyhood inside a house with a great deal of money and a great many family meetings held in low voices behind closed doors. He looked for the first time like a man who was tired.
I have a daughter,
he said quietly. She is 19 years old. She is at Bryn Mawr. She does not know any of this. My grandfather died in 1957. My father died in 1998. I have spent 30 years running a company my grandfather built on the bones of 14 men, and for 30 years I have been told on a regular basis that this is simply the cost of being a Ravencroft, and that the cost is one I am required to pay. He paused. I am not asking you for sympathy, Marlowe. I am only telling you that you are not the first person who has ever stood in front of me and told me what I am. You are the first one I cannot pay to go away. She did not answer. He opened the driver's door of the pickup. I will think he said about which of the 2 men in that story I would rather be. He got into the truck. He pulled the door shut. He sat there a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he started the engine and he turned the truck slowly in the wet clearing, and he drove down the mountain road, and the sound of the engine grew smaller and smaller until it was gone. She stood in the middle of the clearing for a long time after that in the rain without moving. Then she turned and walked back to the trees, and she helped Obadiah Lansing the rest of the way down to the cabin. She did not tell him what Imogen Vance had actually agreed to, which was less than what she had described, but the part about the courthouse steps was true. She fed him a bowl of soup in her grandfather's kitchen. She gave him her grandfather's bed. She sat by the fire and she watched him sleep for an hour to make sure he kept breathing in his sleep the way a person sometimes does not when they have been alone in the woods for 67 years and have suddenly been brought indoors and given a bowl of warm soup. He kept breathing. After a while, she rose quietly and she went back into the study. There was one thing left in the lockbox she had not opened. It was at the very bottom beneath the journal and the letters. A second sealed envelope, plain white, with no name on it. She had seen it on her first night in the cabin. She had not opened it. She had assumed until today that it would be of a piece with the letter to her that had told her who she was. It was not. She broke the seal. She slid out 2 folded pages. The handwriting at the top was Thaddeus Ridgway's. The date at the top was the 11th of March, 1957. To be read only by a person who already knows everything else, the page began. I am going to write this down once, and then I am going to put it where it will not be read by any person who does not already know more than enough to forgive me for it. I am writing it because there has not been a single day in my life since the night of March 3rd, 1957, that I have not been the only person in the world who knew the truth of what happened on the Iron Vein Bridge, and because I have come to believe that a thing of this kind ought to be set down somewhere before the man who knows it dies. On the night of March 3rd, 1957, 4 months after the East Drift was sealed with concrete by order of Ambrose Ravencroft, I drove down the mountain road in my truck, and I parked at the south end of the Iron Vein Bridge. I waited there for 90 minutes in the dark. I had a length of pipe in the cab of the truck. I had decided what I was going to do with it 3 days before, and I had not changed my mind in the 72 hours of thinking about it that I had given myself between the decision and the act. Ambrose Ravencroft drove across that bridge alone every Sunday night at the same hour on his way back from his hunting cabin in the Bitterroot. He drove a long black car with white-walled tires. He drove fast on the open road and slow across the bridge because the bridge was old and narrow and the railings had begun to rust through. I knew this because I had watched him do it for 16 Sundays in a row. On the night of March 3rd, I stepped out of my truck onto the bridge at the south end, and I waved him down with the flashlight in my offhand. He stopped the way a man stops when another man is standing in the road waving a flashlight. He got out of the car. He did not have a driver. He never did. He came to the front of the car, and he asked me what the matter was, and I told him. I told him I had heard what was poured down the airshaft pipe on the morning of October 18th. He understood what I had said. I could see in his face that he understood. He stood there in the headlights of his own car, and he looked at me, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "And what is it you want from me, Mr. Ridgway?" I told him I wanted him to confess. I told him I had nothing to gain personally, and that I would not testify against him in a court of law, because the courts in this county were his. And so I was offering him instead the chance to do the thing himself. I told him to drive down the mountain that night and walk into the sheriff's office in Helena and turn himself in, and that if he did, I would not be the man who came for him. He looked at me for a long time, and then he laughed. He laughed for perhaps 10 seconds. When he stopped laughing, he said,
Mr. Ridgway, I employ in this state alone a great many more men than there were on your crew. The story of those 14 men is over. It was over the day the concrete set. You can wave a flashlight at me on a bridge in the middle of the night if it makes you feel like a man. You can stand here and confess to me your private grief, and I will listen because I am a courteous person and you have been a useful one. But you will not say a word against me to any officer of the law in this state, because there is no officer of the law in this state who will hear you. Now please move out of the road. He turned to walk back to his car. I hit him with the pipe. I hit him once across the back of the skull. I did not mean to kill him. I meant to put him on the ground. He went down. He did not get up. He did not move at all. I stood over him for a long minute, and I understood what I had done, and I understood that there was no version of the rest of my life in which I would tell another living person what had just happened on that bridge. I picked him up under the arms. He was a small man. I carried him to the railing on the upstream side of the bridge. I lowered him over the railing into the river. The river was full of snowmelt and running fast. I watched the body go around the first bend of the river and out of sight. I drove his car off the south end of the bridge into the river. I drove my own truck back up the mountain. I did not sleep that night or for many nights after. His body was found 9 days later, 16 miles downstream in a snag of brush. It was assumed that he had been driving across the bridge and had lost control of the car in the wet, and that he had been thrown clear, and that the car had gone over the side. The car was recovered from the river the following spring. There was no investigation worth the name. Ambrose Ravencroft was buried in the family plot at the Catholic Cemetery in Helena on March 22nd, 1957. I am writing this down on the 11th of March, 1957, because the funeral was yesterday, and because today I have been walking around this cabin for an hour, wondering whether I am the same man I was a week ago. I am not. I do not believe I will ever be that man again. I do not believe I did wrong by Ambrose Ravencroft. I do believe that taking another man's life with my own hand, even a man like that one, is a thing a person carries afterward for the rest of his days. I will carry it. There is one thing more. I had thought until last night that I would one day live in this cabin with Eliza Whitfield and Rosalind Whitfield in some open way that resembled a family. Eliza is a widow, and I am her late husband's friend, and there is no scandal in such a thing, even in a town like this one.
I had thought even before I went down to that bridge that I might in time ask her to marry me. I had thought she might say yes. She is the kindest woman I have ever known. I will not ask her now. I cannot bring a child into a house that contains what is now in my hands. I will marry her on paper when the time comes, only to give Rosalind a name that is not Whitfield. I will live in this cabin alone. I will not have a wife. I will not have other children. I will keep the watch over Callum's blood that I promised his widow I would keep. And I will do it from this side of the mountain, in this house, by myself. This is the price. I will pay it. If you are reading this letter, and if you know my name, then you have already paid your share of it too. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for a great many things. I am not sorry for the night of March 3rd, 1957. The world has fewer men like Ambrose Ravencroft in it tonight than it had a week ago, and that is the only thing I have done in my life of which I am certain my own conscience approves. Burn this when you have read it. She did not burn it. She folded it slowly along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She set the envelope down on the desk, and she sat for a long time with her hand resting flat on top of it. She understood at last why he had never come for her. It was not because he was old. It was not because the Ravencrofts were watching. It was not in the end even because he believed he could not protect her. It was because he had killed a man, and he had decided alone in this cabin on the night of March 11th, 1957, that the child of Callum Whitfield's line was not going to grow up in a house with him while he carried it. He had loved her all those years by staying away. She did not weep over the letter. She did not have the room left inside her for any more weeping that week. She rose instead, and she walked out of the study, and she went into the front room, and she sat down on the floor beside the armchair, where Obadiah Lansing was now awake and looking at the fire. She did not speak. She put her head against the arm of the chair. After a moment, his old hand came down and rested on the top of her head very lightly, the way an old man rests his hand on the head of a child. They sat that way for a long time. The federal inspection of Iron Vein Ridge took place not 3 weeks later, but 6 days later, on the following Monday morning, at the request of Sterling Ravencroft himself, who had driven down to Helena that Saturday and turned over every internal document Ravencroft Holdings possessed on the original 1956 site, along with a signed statement of his own. The story ran on Wednesday. It ran on the front page of 2 newspapers and the top of the home page of 1 news site. It ran with a photograph of Obadiah Lansing standing on the courthouse steps in Helena with his white beard freshly trimmed and a borrowed wool coat on his shoulders, holding the union card of Callum Whitfield in both hands. It ran with a quote from Marlo Whitfield, 22 years old, of Pinehurst Hollow, Montana, who said, "When asked that she was the great-granddaughter of a man who had been buried alive in the East Drift of Iron Vein Ridge in October of 1956, and that she had come to Pinehurst Hollow 6 days earlier without knowing that, and that the only reason she did now was because of a man named Thaddeus Ridgway, who was not her grandfather by blood, but had been her family in every way that mattered for 19 years of her life that she had not even known he was watching. Ravencroft Holdings withdrew its mineral application 2 days after the story ran. The Bureau of Land Management designated the east face of Iron Vein Ridge a protected historical site within the month. Sterling Ravencroft pled to 1 count of attempted obstruction in federal court the following spring and received a sentence of 18 months. He did not appeal. His daughter finished her sophomore year at Bryn Mawr. The memorial was held on a clear, cold afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after Marlowe had stepped off the bus. 14 lanterns were placed along the old trail leading up to the sealed portal of the East Drift, 1 for each man. The town came, all of it. The diner closed for the afternoon. The general store closed. The Methodist church bell rang 14 times at the start of the service, 1 slow toll for each name. Opaline Reddick read the first 7 names from a list she had typed on her grandfather's old typewriter. Garrison Pike read the next 6. Marlowe Whitfield read the last one. Callum Whitfield, she said. My great-grandfather, Obadiah Lansing, 93 years old, now stood at her elbow in a wool coat that had been bought for him in town the week before. When she finished reading her great-grandfather's name, he stepped forward into the silence of the gathered crowd. He drew the union card out of the inside pocket of his coat. He held it up in both hands so that the people in the back could see it, even though they could not possibly have read it from that distance. If a child of mine ever lives, he said in a voice that carried surprisingly much farther than anyone would have guessed an old man's voice could carry. Tell her I knew her name before I knew my own end. He lowered the card. He turned. He placed it gently into Marlowe's hands. He gave her his name, Obadiah said. He gave it to a piece of cardboard in the dark, 60 feet under the ground. He gave it to a man he had never met and to a child who had not been born. He gave it because he believed, against all reason, that someone would carry it back up. You carried it back up, child. He stepped back. She stood at the head of the trail with the card in her hands and the 14 lanterns burning beside her in the cold air of late October in Montana. And she did not speak again because there was nothing further that needed to be said. She lived in the cabin after that. She did not put it up for sale. She did not move into town. She fixed the second hinge on the porch door in the spring. She replaced the shingles on the east side of the roof the following summer. Garrison Pike came up the mountain road every Tuesday to drink coffee with her in the kitchen. Opaline Reddick continued to set aside every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock 1 loaf of bread and a pound of coffee and a jar of preserves and a can of beef stew, and Marlowe came down to pick them up. Obadiah Lansing lived in her grandfather's old bedroom for the last 8 months of his life. He died on a quiet morning in late June, in his sleep, with the window open and the sound of the pines coming in. She buried him on the south corner of the property, under a tall pine that had a clear view in winter of the sealed portal of the East Drift. She buried Thaddeus Ridgway's remains beside him in the empty plot the lawyer had set aside the year before. She did not put a stone on either grave for almost 2 years. When she did, she put up only one stone, a single flat slab of granite that lay across both plots, and on the stone she had only 4 words cut. They watched the door. There are men in Pinehurst Hollow now, old men who will tell you if you ask them that there is a woman living in the cabin at the top of the mountain road who knows the woods up there better than anyone alive. They will tell you that on certain spring evenings, when the wind is right, she walks the old trail to the sealed portal of the East Drift alone, and that she carries a lantern, and that she does not come back down until after dark. They will tell you that the mountain itself is quieter than it used to be, that something in it has finished what it was doing. If you ask them what they mean by that, most of them will not answer. But one of them, a very old man who used to be the sheriff of the county a long time ago, will sometimes look up from his coffee at the diner on Larkspur Street and say, in a voice low enough that only the person across the table from him can hear it, "She carried him back up." That is all he will say. That is all that needs to be said.